In this current moment of time right now, in late September, UFC 296 has already been announced. But the one thing that hasn't been completely announced is the entire card. We do have the main event, the co-main event, and some other marquee matchups that are going to be in this Vegas end of the year card for UFC. And what is really interesting that I think that needs to be brought up are the backgrounds of the two men that are going to be part of the main event. You have Colby Covington, a guy who had a very meteoric rise in the welterweight division, was on the verge of getting cut up until he started basically cut a promo that offended half of the country of Brazil, and then latched on to the persona of being a Trump supporter, only to become one of Trump's favorite fighters and people that he goes and invites to his functions. Of course, with the likes of Jorge Masvidal as part of that entire cast of people as well. But nonetheless, Colby Covington, what is he? Is he a guy that comes from, I guess, a subtle background, a humble background, making it to the top of the UFC based on the fact that he decided to take on this persona? And is he an underrated welterweight contender, if not future champion, and if not future Hall of Famer in the UFC? Right now, we have the current welterweight champion of the world, Leon Edwards, a highly unlikely champion. Of all people, if there was anybody that we thought that could potentially beat Kamaru Usman in his rise to the pound-for-pound number one fighter at the time when he was on top, we would have thought it would be Colby Covington to do so. In fact, we've already seen the matchup with Leon Edwards. So we think to ourselves, well, you know what? Maybe we already know how this is going to go. They go and rematch for the second time around. Gets the headshot knockout. The one shot that Leon Edwards is known for and has created a phrase out of that entire experience that he can now monetize through his merchandise. And then you have the likes of Colby Covington, who we know was in that verge of getting cut, as I mentioned earlier, and now on the verge of becoming one of the biggest superstars in mixed martial arts, if he's not already. Because the guy has this great following with people that, well, for lack of a better term, love the aggressive side of Trump. Whereas with Jorge Masvidal, you could say that he is more of a guy that symbolizes, let's say, the Trump supporter that comes from an immigrant background. People that come from communist countries that have some sort of quarrel with those particular ways of political views and wanted to come to America to live a contrasting life of what they originally experienced in, let's say, Cuba, let's say in Vietnam during the North Vietnamese war days of the 1970s, and all of these things. So these are some things to consider with Colby Covington as a character, as somebody that is blatantly rude, blatantly brash, but above all, somebody that knows he is playing a character and makes no bones about it, will not lie about it, but at the same time, he'll really hold frame in terms of really keeping up with the persona or not breaking character, as they say in the professional wrestling ranks. But one thing that a lot of people don't really understand about Colby Covington, I looked up what the name Covington meant, right? Well, I didn't really get the meaning of it, but the national origin of the Covington name is none other than the origins of Scotland, which I thought was really interesting because guess what? Guess who else has Scottish roots in the MMA world? None other than the Gracie family. If you look at their symbol, which is made of a triangle, that came from somewhat of an influence from a Scottish coat of arms. And you look at Colby Covington, he sort of has a Scottish coat of arms in one of his arms as a tattoo to symbolize, I guess, his long-lost culture or ethnic background that, well, many Americans don't really claim to, or some do, depending on who you ask. But nonetheless, that's what we know Colby Covington to be. Everything that we know America is. Brash, confident, not not hesitant in telling the world, I'm better than you. That's the American spirit, whether we like it or not. Also, part of the American spirit is none other than having a sense of rebellion. Because after all, for those that don't know, America basically came about with a rebellion towards radical ideas. Radical to the sense of, let's say, kings that don't want to allow you to speak how you want to speak, kings that want to overtax you. And of course, maybe in the modern days of America, that could be debatable one way or another, but that's neither here or there. With Leon Edwards, a guy who was highly underestimated, came from a very rough background. A lot of people don't know that this guy had a father who was a crime lord in Jamaica. And not only that, a gun runner. So he spent a lot of time in jail. Leon Edwards didn't grow up with a proper father figure, only to find himself in a brotherhood amongst gym members in Birmingham, in which, by the way, he trained in the same place in none other than Mark Goddard's gym. Mark Goddard, the famous referee, who, by the way, had that little controversy during the first Kamaru Usman Colby Covington fight. Now, what had happened? Well, Mark Goddard was told that he had stopped the fight a little too early. And a lot of people can debate that one way or another. When it comes to Colby Covington, he holds firm in the belief that Mark Goddard is a corrupt Brexit supporter, or I'm sorry, anti-Brexit supporter, because obviously all the Brexit people in the UK tend to lean conservative, and somehow attaches that as this inherent bias that he had against him during the Kamaru Usman fight. So for sure, you're not going to see Mark Goddard referee in this fight. Also, what's interesting is that Leon Edwards does not want Mark Goddard, or Mark Goddard does not want to referee the fights of Leon Edwards. Why? Because he feels that he's going to be biased against him one way or another. And what exactly does that mean? Well, that can go in multiple directions. For one, suppose Leon Edwards is getting battered in between the cage. He's cornered. He looks like he's out of it. But he can also easily protest and say, well, I'm coming back. Now, you got a referee like Mark Goddard. How is he going to look at that? It can go bad both ways. And let me tell you why this inherent bias could be very serious if, let's say, Mark Goddard was to be the referee in this. Because one, if Leon Edwards is getting battered in two double-edged sword ways, what you're getting is a guy that can easily stop it too early because he cares for Leon Edwards, or a guy that will not stop it at all because he cares so much for Leon Edwards that he wants to give him a chance to win the fight, even if supposedly he's getting his butt whooped. So that's the reason why you're not going to see Mark Goddard referee this fight, and rightfully so, because of these reasons we just mentioned. So when we have Leon Edwards in this situation, let's talk about the kicks and punches, because usually one of the things that they love to say about British guys is that they can't wrestle. Okay, this is true for the most part, but MMA wrestling and wrestling in terms of just the pure sport in and of itself are two completely different sports. And that's something that we have to understand. Well, for one, you can set up jabs and 1-2s in MMA and then go for a double leg and a single leg takedown. You can stomp your opponent's feet while you have them pushed up against a cage in situations that you will never see in a scholastic wrestling match, because there is no cage. There is nothing behind you that's going to help you if, let's say, somebody is going to push you away from, let's say, the mat. It's not going to happen. You're not going to get any protection off your back. So in regular wrestling, when you shoot for a double leg takedown, or when you clinch up and then you get to a position where you're able to take the opponent down, there's only a couple of places to go, and that's nowhere near a cage. It's within a circle of a mat, and there is nothing in that mat, and there's an out-of-bounds line that resets you after, let's say, you step out of that circle in which you're supposed to compete in within the mat. And this is scholastic wrestling I'm talking about within the circumference of its rules and its competitive environment. But with MMA, you have the cage, you have the setup of kicks, you have the setup of punches, and then you have the setup of clinches with knees to go along with the combinations of getting a single or double leg takedown. So this is important to understand. And Leon Edwards has proven that in the first fight with Kamaru Usman, being able to mount him and being able to take him down. By the way, a wrestler that a lot of people were never able to take down throughout his entire championship run as a welterweight champion, and I'm talking about Kamaru Usman. They weren't able to do that. Nobody was able to do that. Maybe Colby Covington, but then it was very controversial because they say that, well, in the world of wrestling, it could be considered a takedown, but in the world of MMA, it's not considered a takedown. In comes Leon Edwards, a guy who's been taken down multiple times by Kamaru Usman in the first fight, and then in their second fight for the world championship, ends up taking him down multiple times and showing that he has had a very huge improvement in his grappling and wrestling game. And lo and behold, he is one of the most deadliest strikers in the history of the 170 division. And I'm talking about Leon Edwards. And he's proven that. So now what do we have with Leon Edwards? A very well-proven champion, well-rounded, and an ever-improving wrestling game. Now what does that say for Colby Covington in terms of how he's going to deal with his matchup? Well, for sure, right off the gate, he's going to go and shoot for a single leg or a double leg takedown from the beginning of the round, just to establish dominance, just to show Leon Edwards that he doesn't belong in the level of wrestling that Colby Covington is in. And he's going to try to grind him out from early of round 1 all the way to round 5, if it even lasts that far. Now, what is the job of Leon Edwards? Well, his job and main purpose is to do one thing, and that is to basically knock him out whenever there's an opening. Because that's what he did with what Leon Edwards did in the Kamaru Usman fight. So that's what Leon Edwards is going to do in the Colby Covington fight. So how did Colby Covington do against Kamaru Usman, a man that we've seen Leon Edwards knock out? Well, we've seen what happened. In the first fight, the fifth round of the final round of the championship with Kamaru Usman and none other than Colby Covington, Colby Covington gets knocked out, gets his jaw broken, and the entire match stopped from the ground and pound position after he was hit in the jaw, all stopped by none other than Mark Goddard, the guy that I had just mentioned earlier, the referee who owned the gym that none other than Leon Edwards was a part of when he was a teen. So, again, a little bit of some biasness and a little bit of some hidden history between these two men that a lot of people are not pointing out. Because obviously we know about the rivalry between Usman and Colby Covington, highly documented. And you've had you've had Colby Covington beef with all types of people even outside of the weight class. But nonetheless, what we have going on here is a very even 50-50 fight, very similar to what is going to happen with Charlo and Canelo this weekend for the boxing match for the undisputed 168-pound championship. Ironically enough, I believe this is the equivalence of that weight class division. 168 in boxing, 2 pounds over in MMA, 170. It's the same weight class. But obviously, these are two big 170-pounders when we're talking about, smaller 170-pounders when we're talking about Charlo and Canelo. Speaking of small 170 guys, Colby Covington has been known to be a small welterweight throughout his entire career. A lot of people go out and cite this aspect of maybe he should go out and move up a weight class, move down a weight class because he's so small he could fit 155. The thing is that Colby Covington doesn't want to do that. He wants to be able to withhold his stamina for a longer period of time. For those of you that don't know, Colby Covington trains with the likes of Cameron Haynes, a very good friend of Joe Rogan, who is not only an outdoors hunter, but is also an ultra marathon runner. What exactly is ultra marathon runner? People that literally go out and run 100 miles. So this is the type of person that Colby Covington trains with, and it is no wonder that Colby Covington has some of the most insane stamina when it comes to his fighting abilities and how he goes about in the championship rounds throughout the fights that he's had all throughout the UFC in his entire career. Unless, of course, you go out and put his lights out. And this is where Leon Edwards comes in. Leon Edwards comes in at the fact that he can end your lights out at any time, and he's proven that with Kamaru Usman. Obviously, in the last fight, it went to a decision with the rematch for the championship, the trilogy that Usman and Leon Edwards had. It kind of showed you what Leon Edwards is able to do as a championship fighter defending his title, going to the distance. It showed you that. And I think it's going to show you a lot in how he's going to compete with Colby Covington. In all honesty, how I see this fight, I don't see this going to a finish with either guy. And I'm going to tell you why. These two men are highly improved. It doesn't matter what you've seen from them before. It doesn't matter if you've seen Leon Edwards take a loss against freaking Kamaru Usman. That was back in 2015. It doesn't matter if you've seen Colby Covington get slept by none other than Kamaru Usman, because guess what? He's improved his striking along the way, and I think that it's one of those improvements that's good enough for him to be able to show a difference in this particular fight with Colby Covington. George St. Pierre once said that he is the king of rematches. And I'm going to tell you why this is very important. Obviously, I'm talking about a guy who has held the championship and is now being carried in that lineage by none other than Leon Edwards. So what George St. Pierre said was one of the reasons why he was great at rematches was because he had this great ability to adapt. Whereas with most people, they look at a rematch and say, well, this is the same fight. I know how it felt. I know I wasn't too tired when I did this fight because I know that I could handle this guy's output. I could handle his offense. My defense is on point to handle that particular circumference. My offense is on point in ways that it can penetrate his defense, to which is going to be leveraged to my favor. So these are the thoughts that you have going into your mind, going into a rematch that you've already won, and thinking you're going to do the same thing. But the one thing that a lot of people tend to forget is that every fight is different. And Kamaru Usman's fight with Leon Edwards 3 times proves that. The first fight was a 3-round fight, so you got to take into consideration the level of pace that they were inputting as opposed to, let's say, how they would perform under a 5-round condition like Utah in the second time around where it was on high elevation. So these are some factors to take into consideration when you're looking at the contrasting difference of match 1 from match 2 to match 3 and match quadruple whatever. That's what you got to understand. Every match is different, which is why I see this fight with Colby Covington and Leon Edwards as a very 50-50 fight. I don't see this fight going in a one-sided direction from one guy to another, because let's say if you even want to look at it from the fact that Colby Covington may be the favorite, is that the odds? I don't know. I'm not a gambling guy, but I'm willing to bet that he is the favorite based on his wrestling. If he implements that wrestling, it's not going to be a guarantee that he stays on a top position the whole entire fight. Eventually, just like what happened in the Kamaru Usman fight, he was able to get up. After he was able to get up, he was able to be very dangerous on the feet to the point where he could have caused a lot of problems for Kamaru Usman, even in the third fight. And, I mean, obviously caused a whole lot of problems in the second fight where he was able to head kick him and finish him off. Now, why am I comparing Kamaru Usman into this situation? I'm going to tell you why, because I truly believe that Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington are equal. Just because their two results may vary or may just be no different from one to the other in terms of Kamaru Usman winning both contests, one by knockout, one by decision, they're still very even because on any given day, Colby Covington could have been the one that finished off Kamaru Usman, but it was Kamaru Usman that had finished off Colby Covington. And in the end, we still got to see the top level prowess of Colby Covington, his ability, how he can match up with the top level guys of the 170 division. And the fact is that, well, maybe all of that won't matter in this fight. Maybe the fact that, yes, we rank Colby Covington very high could be very suspicious because of his absence, because of his lack of activity, because of the fact that you look at a lot of the names that he's beaten, a lot of them are no longer in the UFC, so you got to wonder how he's going to contend with the new and upcoming guys in this particular division. This is why I can tell you that I compare this fight to Canelo and Charlo. And who is Charlo and who is Canelo in this situation? Well, I'll tell you. Colby Covington is Canelo, the proven guy, the guy who's been there in the top marquee matchups. And Leon Edwards is Charlo, this new upcoming champion that is proven to have fought some of the toughest guys in the division time in and time out, and has proven himself to be the top dog of that division time in and time out, and perhaps maybe has taken on tougher competition than, let's say, Canelo. But then again, Canelo in this case is the one that was taking most of the tougher competitions. So what am I comparing Colby Covington to Canelo for? The damage. The fact that they've fought for so long, and sometimes the longer that you fight, the more that it affects how you're going to fight in your upcoming match. Because you may have looked great in your past matchups, but eventually all this accumulation of damage, accumulation of rounds, and training hard for years and years on out, and then take into consideration the fact that Colby Covington, guess what? He's been a wrestler for a long time. So how's he going to deal with the possible injuries and wear and tear that he's had over the years? How is he going to perform with somebody like Leon Edwards, who hasn't had that, but is a full-time mixed martial artist, an ever-evolving mixed martial arts fighter at that, and an ever-improving wrestling skills to go along with his championship run? So, as an early prediction, I can't give you the winner, but I can give you the result. It's going to go to a decision.